Good morning. My name is Doersch, and I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about myself, I guess. I've taught middle school science for about 33 years in Seymour, but I certainly do not consider myself an expert in science at all. I also am teaching currently confirmation at Emmanuel in Seymour, and have done that for over 33 years. But again, I don't consider myself a theologian by any means. So I'm coming at you as what I am, just a regular guy that has somehow come to terms with what seems to be apparent discrepancies between science and God, and especially some of the theories of science. So I'd like to start with a story. There's an old Cherokee story that has a grandfather talking to a grandson, and he tells the grandson, "Inside each one of us are two wolves that are battling each other. One of them is an evil wolf, which is full of pride and greed and jealousy and anger and selfishness. And the other wolf is a good wolf that is full of love and peace and truth and caring and generosity." And the grandchild asks the grandfather, "Well, which wolf wins?" And the grandfather simply says, "The one you feed." And that kind of thinking seems to follow closely with this topic to some degree, I think. Scientists like Einstein have found God more and more as he discovered new concepts in science. And then there's other scientists, such as Stephen Hawking and the famous Bill Nye the Science Guy, who claim that humans are just the next step on this evolutionary timeline. So it seems to me that all of these scientists are intelligent men, and yet about half scientists believe in God, and the other half of the scientists don't believe in God. They each are finding food for their opinion, apparently. So let me give you an example of what some of that food looks like. Back in the 80s, it became proven that scientists knew a lot about chromosomes and genes. And they actually were able to isolate the gene on a firefly that makes the proteins that it makes it glow. And to prove that those genes could be read by another organism, they took that gene and inserted it into a tobacco plant. And that tobacco plant glowed. In other words, it could read the genes from an animal, from the insect, the firefly. And that really is an example of where, okay, that signifies that all things, plants, animals, everything is reading and using the same set of directions, which leads us to believe that we all came from the same place. Of course, the people that are the non-believers would say, well, that came from the very first living one-celled organism. The believers would say, well, that came from God, the source of everything. Of course it would be all the same. So it's the same sort of fact interpreted in two different ways. If your mind's already made up about this topic, which some people are very polar on this, I'm not probably going to say anything that's going to change your mind. But if you've been one that's kind of been on the fence or kind of been in the back of your mind thinking, I wonder how this all fits together, that's my topic. I'm going to try to share with you that you can make these two fit together. But as an aside, I'm not implying that one of these is good and one of these is bad, sort of like the wolf story. The wolf analogy was just to illustrate that we tend to find what we seek. What I am saying, though, is that I believe both science and religion have overstepped their areas in different places, and that tends to add confusion to the whole issue. So I divided up my topic into three parts: the age of the earth and evolution, where science falls short, in my opinion. And then the third part is, what are the chances? So let's start with this. There's a Bible-based interpretation of the age of the earth, saying that our planet is not billions of years old, as the scientists would say, but the young earth creationists tell us that the earth is about 6,000 years old. They get this age by adding up all of the generations that are mentioned in the Bible, from Adam and Eve through Jesus and then so on. As a teacher, I see these attempts at extrapolating information being beyond the Bible's scope and purpose. Think of the confusion, again, as a teacher, that a teenager would have as they hear scientists have discovered ocean animal and plant fossils at the top of the highest mountain range on Earth, the Himalayas. Some simple math would say that, okay, this 29,000 plus foot mountain range, if it's only 6,000 years old, would simply mean that this mountain range has been raising in elevation at about 5 feet a year. It's hard to believe for a teenager, I would say. So how do these young Earth creationists explain dinosaurs together with humans? Because they would have had to have been together if it's only 6,000 years old. And one of their theories is that dinosaurs terrorized people so much that they were hunted to death. And another one is that they ran out of food and killed each other. So from a science perspective, I think they're overstepping their bounds. And emotions certainly do tend to run high when it comes to this debate on how humans began. I mean, there's no doubt about that. For me, the Bible's messages are written in many forms and writing styles for many diverse readers. For instance, 1 Corinthians says, women should remain silent in churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. Are we to take that literally? Or Matthew says, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. Does that mean that only having one eye is going to make us impervious to sin? For me, another place that the Bible opens up an idea to multiple interpretations is actually the creation story itself, which there are two of them. In the first story, the earth is created, and then plants, and then light, and then animals, and finally humans. In the second creation story, animals are created after Adam to be companions for him. So which is true? Of course, there are arguments that say that the second version is simply a zoomed-in explanation of the first version. But another argument says that there's a misinterpretation, or actually it was mistranslated, when they used the word God formed as part of the verse, and it should have been written instead, now the Lord God had formed. So it was sort of a past tense thing, and it kind of would dismiss this apparent conflict, signifying that God had already made the animals and kind of set them off to the side, waiting for Adam to give them names. But all versions of the Bible, in verse 18, say, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable. To me, this indicates that God will be, in the future, offering suitable companions in the form of animals and birds. So as a reader, I get a fuller picture, I think, of God, the Creator, by having both versions. We see different aspects of his character from each one. Even writers today commonly vary their style of writing and their language to best communicate their message. And I have one other aside on this that I have not found anyone to substantiate it or not, but it just kind of fit in when I put these two thoughts together. And one is that it's awful evident in the Bible that God has not made us to be robots and will never force us to love him. He gives us the choice to accept him as our Savior or not. Choices are always up to us. And I'm thinking, well, if us being the chosen sort of organisms on this earth, then why would it be any different for the organisms, including animals and plants? Why would he not set up the forces of nature that affect all living things and then start life and let them have the freedom, as we have the freedom to make our choices, to develop as the demands of nature change? Just a thought. I've never found any substantiation for that. Even Pope Francis says that God was not a magician with an all-powerful magic wand. He created beings and let them develop according to the internal laws which he endowed in each one, that they may develop and reach their fullness. Since it has been demonstrated that all living organisms on earth are genetically related, it is virtually certain that all living things have descended from this first organism. Kind of interesting when I found that out. Okay, part two, where science falls short. It's the nature of science, of course, to make theories. And then they take that theory and they find evidence that either supports it or refutes it. The problem with theories is that people tend to view them as facts, and a little bit early before they're actually considered a law. They're simply the best ideas at the time to explain some, mystery that we don't know. Science should be confined, I believe, to the observable world, and therefore has nothing to say about any non-observable realm. A scientist can claim that science proves God. Let me try that again. A scientist that claims that science proves God does not exist, I think, is a poor scientist. It seems to me that religion deals mainly with the field of the non-observable things, like holiness and sin and God and heaven and spirit. Could it be then, when science and religion seem to contradict each other, it's actually an instance where science has wandered beyond its bounds of the observable world, or the religious interpretation has wandered beyond the unobservable or the spiritual world? In my mind, there's a couple of places where science certainly does not seem to have a very plausible theory. One of them is how life began. Even if life began as a single-celled, very primitive organism, there had to be some time when non-living material was suddenly living and made of proteins. Experiments have been attempted trying to replicate the atmosphere from millions of years ago, sparking an electric shock into the mix, and they have been able to produce some amino acids, but nothing ever resulted that's anything close to life. To create even the basic form of life, we need a minimum of 250 different proteins, and each one with its own base pairs of A's, C's, G's, and T's in the correct order. So the base pairs have got to be in the correct order, and the 250 proteins have got to be in the correct order to make life. That's a lot of random combinations to just happen by chance. Another theory that's really well documented is the Big Bang theory, because as they can measure, as scientists have measured both the distance and the direction of all the galaxies and planets and whatnot, it's pretty obvious that they're all moving out from a central point. But who put the matter there in the first place? Science will never have an answer for that. And then there's the medical healings that totally baffle doctors and scientists. Scientists has no explanation for these. And in fact, doctors are occasionally pressured to explain them as a misdiagnosis or just coincidence. If you're interested in this topic at all, I would highly recommend a book called The Case for Miracles by Lee Strobel, who, by the way, also wrote The Case for Christ when he describes his conversion from an atheist to a Christian. One of the people that Lee interviews is Craig Keener, who also was an atheist, very skeptical, and caused him to actually demand multiple credible witnesses before he recorded these as a miracle. So I'm going to just read an excerpt, pieces of one of these miracles that is quoted in this book. This account is from a girl from Minnesota named Barbara. After high school, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at the Mayo Clinic. Over the next 16 years, her condition deteriorated as she spent months in hospitals, often for pneumonia. One diaphragm was paralyzed, the other operated at less than 50%. A trach tube was inserted in her neck, and a feeding tube inserted in her stomach. She was legally blind and had lost control of her urination and bowels. One of Barbara's surgeons declared that she was one of the most hopelessly ill patients he had ever seen. As she entered hospice care, she hadn't walked for 7 years, and her body was twisted into a fetal position. One day, someone called in Barbara's story to the radio station of the Moody Bible Institute. A request was broadcast for listeners to pray for her. Over 450 Christian listeners wrote letters to Barbara's church saying that they were lifting her up in prayer. On Pentecost Sunday, her aunt came over to read some of these letters. Suddenly, during a lull in the conversation, Barbara heard a man's voice speak from behind her, even though there was no one else in the room. The words were clear and spoken with authority, but also with great compassion. "My child, get up and walk." Seeing Barbara had become agitated, one of her friends plugged the hole in her neck so she could speak. "I don't know what you're going to think about this," Barbara told them, "but God just told me to get up and walk." Her friends ran to get the rest of the family as Barbara felt compelled to immediately do what she was told. She literally jumped out of bed, removed the oxygen, Her vision was back and was standing on legs that had not supported her for years. After hugs and dancing with joy, everyone offered a tearful prayer of thanksgiving. Many family members, as well as a physician that practiced at Mayo for over 30 years, all witnessed this event. Science has no answer for those kinds of things. All right, part 3. What are the chances? Not many years ago, in fact, when I was being trained for science, it was common to think that there are millions of places in our universe that could also have the right conditions for life. And it's interesting to me that in this case, science seems to be now actually finding evidence that supports Earth being a one-of-a-kind planet like no place else in the universe. Physicists have recently discovered the precision required for the Big Bang. If too much matter was present, gravity would collapse on itself before the stars and planets could form. With too little matter, stars and planets would never form. And this is far beyond my science understanding, but I'm trusting what I've read. Physicists have developed this theory that now suggests that after the Big Bang, the amount of matter in the universe was precisely tuned to 1 part in a trillion. Even a small amount of extra matter or less would mean no universe. Here's another example. The ratio of electromagnetic force to gravitational force is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10,000 trillion. And just to understand that ratio, imagine covering a billion with a B, North American continents with dimes all the way to the moon. Choose one of those dimes, paint it red, and put it somewhere in the mountains of dimes. Blindfold a friend and have him pick one dime from the billion continents. The odds of him selecting the red one are 1 in 10,000 trillion. How about one more? Scientists have also discovered that you can't just be anywhere in a galaxy and have a chance for life to exist. If your sun, star, is too close to the center of the galaxy, in our case the Milky Way, there's too much radiation and likely a black hole, and it would destroy it. If your sun is too far away from the center, the planets don't have enough a way of acquiring the heavy elements that they need, like oxygen and carbon, which are the basics of life. You have to be in what's called the Goldilocks zone, that perfect in the middle zone. How about one more? Your star must also be in its middle age, so its light energy is stable. It has to be a bachelor star. A lot of stars are binary, which means they rotate around each other. It has to be a bachelor star. And it also has to be in its 3rd generation. The 1st generation stars are made up of helium and hydrogen, which would be gaseous planets around it. The 2nd generation has some heavy elements, but you finally have to be in the 3rd generation of a star before it has enough heavy elements to create a rocky planet like Earth. So one estimate of the number of planets in our Milky Way that would meet one of these criteria is around 1 billion trillion. And that sounds pretty impressive. But when all the conditions are required for life that I just went over are all considered, our perfect placement within the galaxy, the exact correct gravitational electromagnetic forces, the precise amount of matter in the original Big Bang, the probability of another planet with life on Earth comes to 1 in a million trillion, and all those trillions on there. In science, they would say it ain't going to happen. So in conclusion, I think we need to trust God that He's got this. He's still in control. And there will be more controversy as science discovers more and more. But we need to remember God's got this. Secondly, I think, at least for me, the more science finds out and discovers, the more God becomes bigger in my mind, and the more special it is for Him to count us as being so special in His mind, made in His image. I mean, that becomes more and more revolutionary to me. And thirdly, I think our future as a nation is contingent on staying on the cutting edge of technology in the world. And that requires science being truth and based on truth. So I think we can be zealous for God without suggesting that the Bible's got answers for everything. Thank you.